Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I'm loud, aren't I? Welcome to this session. It's a real honor to be here to speak today amongst all these amazing people from the Java community. I have to apologize because I'm not a Java specialist, so you're not going to hear anything about Java today. What you are going to hear about is how to make browsers cool and powerful and super heroic, possibly. Can I just quickly have a show of hands? Does anybody know what I'm going to talk about? Yeah, one or two. Good. All right, you might be able to help me out later on. So just a quick thing about me. I'm a kind of strange hybrid sort of person. I used to be a consultant, but I thought actually programming my children would be more entertaining, so I stopped working full-time a while ago. But slowly over the years, I've kind of got back into it, and in the last couple of years, I've been more and more involved in this community around AngularJS. And so the people in Google who wrote this have sort of embraced some of the community members, and I've been one of those lucky enough to sort of be brought into the fold, as it were. So I'm not quite the horse's mouth, but close enough. I'm going to talk about a variety of things, but first of all, I wanted to just ask who drove here today? Yeah. Was it fun? Ah, well, they're not motorbikes, all right then. Personally, I live in London, okay, so up until a few years ago, it was absolutely disastrous to drive in London. Then they introduced this congestion charge, and it's got a little bit better, but still it's pretty grim. And if you're driving around in London, you basically feel like you're a bit of a snail, and you don't really get to go very fast. So I was thinking, well, how can I get around London faster? So the technological way of thinking about it, or perhaps, I don't know, some people would think about it as what I actually need is a faster car, right? So if I get myself a bigger, faster, more powerful car, then I'll be able to race down those roads and get to work faster or wherever I want to go. But of course, in reality, the problem is not how fast your car is, it's the fact that the roads in London are completely congested. So what you really need to do is think outside the box. And you need to think, well, how am I actually going to get from A to B more effectively? So perhaps I could be really innovative and come up with a little flying car. And I like that idea, but I've got a feeling it might end in disaster. So perhaps a bicycle is better. Sometimes the most simple answers are hiding in your back garden or in a shed somewhere. And this is kind of a theme that's going on in the browser at the moment. People are sort of pushing things onto it to try and make it better, but actually maybe they're missing the point. So a brief history of browsers and things like that. Browsers were developed in the late 80s, and at that time, what people wanted to do was read documents, basically. They had loads of documents hidden on servers. No one could get to them. So they created this cool thing called the web, and also to be able to link from one document to another. And browsers are brilliant at that. And obviously, as everyone knows, it took off a little bit. But that's all it really did for a long time. Some people tried to squeeze a little Java applets into there to make it more funky, but it never really took off. But then in 1995, someone created a thing called LiveScript, which was briefly, or very quickly renamed to JavaScript, probably poorly. And this allowed people to actually start to interact with what was going on in the document. Originally, it was just to kind of help developers who didn't want to write Java applets to interact with the forms that were on the pages, maybe do a little bit of dynamic work. But it was never really kind of thought through exactly how it was going to work. But despite that, lots of clever developers, much like yourselves, managed to create quite impressive bits of kit that sat on top of web pages. And breaking into the 21st century, Ajax came along. And what this provided was the opportunity to have an application or a web page that sat there and communicated with the server without refreshing all the time. So you got a completely different experience for the user, because instead of having to constantly wait for the whole page to be refreshed and it to try and work out what you were in the middle of doing, it could just kind of pull bits of information in, make posts, changes, and that led to a whole new array of applications, which are often described as single-page applications. Unfortunately, because these applications were never designed from the beginning in a browser, browsers were not really very good at supporting it. jQuery came along and tried to unify the interface that you use to talk to the DOM, because even now, talking to a DOM across different browsers is nigh on impossible. But still, jQuery was really just a very thin layer that kind of hid DOM manipulation. It didn't really provide an opportunity to build enterprise applications or real applications. Despite that, obviously, people are building web applications using jQuery. But, and this is what we're kind of looking towards now. There are more and more applications which just sit as using the browser as the operating system, basically. It's an application development platform, or an application sort of deployment platform. And I think going forward, this is where people are moving more and more towards. And the fact that you're sitting in this room means that perhaps you agree with me. But the trouble is, it's quite hard. You know, even with jQuery kind of tidying things up for us, most people who just try and write a vanilla jQuery stroke JavaScript application that runs in a browser find it really hard, because you end up writing loads of boilerplate code, and you end up getting all mismatch of different couplings between different parts of the application that you really don't want. And so what we really need is some people to help us. So over the last couple of years, possibly starting with Backbone, there's a number of frameworks that have come out to try and provide us with a systematic way of creating applications. They agree on many things. Particularly, they agree that you can't just take a server-based application and try and plug bits onto it and make it into a single-page application. You have to pretty much start from scratch and build up from a proper framework. And the framework that everyone pretty much agrees on is that it should be model, view, something, okay? Whatever. The model is your data, the view is basically HTML, or what will end up being HTML, and the whatever kind of joins it together. And there's some disagreement about that, but in practice it doesn't really matter. They also agree that the browser needs to have some way of binding your data to the view, and they do it in different ways. Some of these guys are using a specific backend, so things like Meteor, possibly Backbone and CanJS. They expect a particular kind of backend, but other ones are pretty agnostic to that. They all agree that we should bind data from your model to the view, but they do it in lots of different ways. And Angular has a particular way of doing it, which is somewhat controversial. And some of these guys think that you should use HTML as your template, but some of them say, well, actually, HTML is a bit messy. It's very verbose. So what we're going to do is actually create our views in JavaScript, and then we'll turn that JavaScript into HTML views later on. So, as I was saying, sometimes the real problem is not which framework you take, because they're all quite good and they're written by very, very clever people. But the real problem is that, as I said earlier, the browser was never really designed in the first place to be an application platform. It'd be a bit like saying, okay, right, Adobe Reader is really cool, but why don't we make it into an application development platform? Yeah, and we'll build applications you write an application as a PDF and you deploy it, and then people can play games in Adobe Reader. That's not like the point, but that's what people have done with browsers. Can you actually do that, by the way? I don't know. You can. That's scary. Okay. That's really weird. Okay. But what browsers do really well is that they're really good at displaying data, and they're really good at marking up data in a specification-based way, rather than being imperative. You know, they allow you to lay out your things in a semantic way, put some styling on it, and so on. What they don't do very well is support a data model where your application needs to store stuff. And also, it's quite hard to, if you want to make something that's attractive, you end up writing lots of HTML all the time, which is repeated over and over again. But we're getting there, and as you can see, HTML5 is in some ways designed to kind of fix all of these problems that browsers have. We talked about web components, I think, in one of the talks yesterday. And these are kind of widgets that you can create in a browser and push straight onto through HTML. This thing called Object Observe is something coming into JavaScript, which allows you to actually listen to changes on your data and react to it. And this history.push state is something where, I'm sure you're aware, it allows you to have deep linking URLs that go into your single page web app and allows you to move from state to state using the URL as a track of where you've been, and also allow you to jump straight into a point in an application. It doesn't necessarily relate to an HTML page. So these are good things, but no, they're not quite there yet. There are many browsers that don't support HTML5 fully, and even those that do, there are still things to do. So there's this nice bloke who lives in California called Mishko Hevery, and he decided that what we really need is to start again with the browser. We need to take the browser and say, okay, what if this browser was designed from the beginning to be an application development platform? Yeah, what would it really need to do? And then he wrote a framework which would basically fill in that gap until browsers caught up. There's a little story about how Angular kind of came to be. So Mishko was working at Google, and he was in a team building an application using the Google Web Toolkit. And apparently they spent 6 months with 3 developers. They built 17,000 lines of code, but the project really wasn't getting anywhere. And in the background, Mishko had been playing with this idea of Angular. And he went to his project manager and said, do you know what? I can rewrite this whole application from scratch using my framework in 2 weeks. And Google being what it is, they said, that's an interesting innovation. So the project manager said, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So he gave him 2 weeks to go away. He worked basically 24 hours a day and failed. It took him 3 weeks to reproduce the application. So it was a bit disappointing for him, I know. And his final application, compared to the 17,000 lines they had originally, was only 1,000 lines long. So I think what happened at that point was that the project manager at Google said, I think what we should do is turn this into a proper project. So it then got backing from Google, and they started building a team around it. And over the last couple of years, they've turned it from this prototype that he was working on to something which is now 1.1, almost 1.2 version. And going forward, there's a lot of backing from Google. They're starting to use it in-house to develop projects, and they're trying to sell it to the community. So some of the core features of AngularJS. By the way, this is kind of the marketing spiel, yeah? I'm going to do some code and stuff in a minute. So depending on whether you like this stuff or the code, you might want to leave halfway through. One of the things that AngularJS does, which is quite dissimilar to most frameworks, is that they just say your model is just your own. You do whatever you like with it. It's just a load of JavaScript objects, POJs, plain old JavaScript objects. And you don't have to inherit from anything. You don't have to plug sort of adapters onto your code. You just have whatever you like. And this makes a really nice, clean code. And what they do is, Angular does, is it constantly checks your data for changes. This is where I was talking about object observe earlier. And when that data changes, it triggers various handlers, updates bindings to the view, and so on for you. So you don't have to worry about any of that. This is a major area of problem in most JavaScript applications, dealing with this tracking of your model and updating the view. One thing that they do, again, which is very dissimilar to many of the other frameworks, is they use the DOM as the template. So some frameworks use a string-based like templating system, and the framework parses the strings and converts it to HTML. Some use JavaScript, so that you create a JavaScript object model and it converts it to HTML. But in Angular, we actually have the DOM sort of parsed by the browser itself, and then we take the DOM and use that as our view, as our template, and apply certain compilation to it to add in bits and pieces that we want. What this allows us to do is actually to create our own HTML syntax, which can sit on top of normal or sort of standard HTML elements and attributes, and we can create a domain-specific language for each application that we want to write. And it means that our views become very declarative and domain-specific, and that also leads to a great decrease in the amount of code you have to write. On the code side, so that was mostly on the view side. On the code side, Angular has a dependency injection framework, so think Spring or Google Juice or some of these other frameworks. There aren't many JavaScript, if hardly any at all, JavaScript dependency injection frameworks. And this is a brilliant piece of work by Mishko, because it leads to a real decoupling of your layers, allows you to do testing. Angular encourages you to test. It supports your tests. It comes with integrations with Mocha, which is a JavaScript testing environment, straight out the box, and you can get up and running with tests, which I'll show you in a minute from the get-go. And that way you can do test-driven development, which traditionally is very hard in JavaScript web browser applications, because you spend all this trying to work out what's going on with the DOM, why is it looking like that, and rather than actually focusing on testing your code. And it provides a few services which you can inject into your code as you need it. So now we're going to get to the juicy stuff. I'm going to go through sort of evolution of a really simple application. I thought it'd be nice to just see how you could layer up more and more complexity from a really simple application. And hopefully this will give you an idea of how you can sort of build things with Angular. Right, so what we've got here is a really simple HTML document. There's only a few things that I've added. First of all, I've loaded up a script file, which is called angular.js. This is the whole library that we need. We don't need anything else for our basic application. We load that up, and then here, in the body tag, I've got what appears to be something that's not normal, and it's called a directive. And basically, it's something that's specific to AngularJS, and this defines everything within the body as being an AngularJS application. Okay, it doesn't have to appear on the body. It could be somewhere further down. You could just have it on a div in the middle of your web page. So this kind of allows you to plug in an AngularJS application into your current web pages. The next thing that you'll notice maybe is that I've got an input box here, and again, there's something that's not normal. It's this ng model attribute, and again, this is an AngularJS directive, which basically says, please connect whatever I type into this input box to a thing called from in my data model. And then finally, we've got one last attribute here, which is a bit new, called ngBind, and this says bind this expression to this span. So whenever that expression changes, update this span to be this expression. I'll talk a minute about what it means to have that little number colon 2 there. But let's just see this in action. It's very exciting. Okay. So I need £200, and I get 390 euros and 60 cents. You can see that it's changing as I type. And there was no code. Now, I'm not saying that your applications won't have any code, but this is kind of neat, isn't it? Immediately, I'm not having to do all of that DOM manipulation, that checking of handlers for the input box, and then updating things in the DOM. It just happens all for me straight away. So what you'll notice is that this euros has nice commas and dots to make it look like a currency, and that, if we go back to here, is what this number colon 2 does. So any expression which you use in Angular can have this thing called a filter attached to it. And basically you put a pipe, and then you can apply different filters. You can have more than one chained on the end of here. And what this one just says is use a particular filter called number filter, and we need 2 decimal places. So this is all very well and good, but what we're going to do is move a bit forward. This looks a lot more complicated, but in reality, all I've really done is linked to some Bootstrap CSS to make it look a bit more pretty. And because Bootstrap has a particular way of everything being laid out, you have to put classes everywhere. So it kind of makes it a little bit more messy and complicated, but you'll appreciate the aesthetics of it later. So if we move down here, again, we've got our ng model from val here. But what I've also added in is a select, which allows us to choose different currencies. But this select also has a model, which is called from currency. So as you choose your select, it's going to update the currency value in our model. And then all the way down here, we've got a to currency. And then finally, so I move that up a bit. Doesn't go much further. Finally, this time I've got an input box, and I've styled it to be read-only. And you can see here that I'm doing a little calculation from val is divided by the from currency to the to currency. And if we run this, we can see that if we select a couple of currencies, stick in £200 again, then it updates it. If I want to go from pounds to pounds, £200, £200. If we go from euros to pounds, then it all changes in the background. And again, I'm not having to write any of the boilerplate code to keep all of this updated. So that means I can focus on my business rules. And my business rules are things like the fact that I want to divide the value by the from currency and multiply it by the to currency. Okay? But this is not really high quality software engineering. You know, this is We don't really want to be doing this kind of stuff in our view. Okay, it can be done, but it's not ideal. So what I talked about earlier with dependency injection, we can actually create code which sits behind this view, and we can put all of our business logic into that. That then is detached from our view, and we can test it independently from the declarative bindings. So our next version, you can see, has a few more files. So let's just look at the index again. There's not much difference, except you'll notice that way down the bottom, instead of binding that hard-coded expression in here, I've now got a function call that says calc currency, or 0. And that calc currency is now hiding inside some code that's separate. And what I ought to explain first, before showing where that code is where is this model being stored? Yeah, this data that I'm interacting with, that I'm able to bind to. So one of the features of AngularJS is that they create a scope. They call it a scope, but basically it's a data model, and it's attached to your ng app. So at the point where your ng app is, there is a data model created, and you can it's just a JavaScript object, and you can add two things to it. And so whenever I do things like bind, say, this ng model to from currency, that's actually creating a property on that scope, saying on our scope we've got a property called from currency, and whenever this changes, update that property. Okay. So what we can do is attach what's called a controller to our code. So this is kind of the whatever bit of the MVW. Now our controller is code behind. It's the business logic that supports this. Some people might call it a view model, and it looks quite simple. Although I've filled this with comments, so it makes it more complicated. Everything in Angular is stored in a module. So first of all, I create myself a module. I'm calling it app. Has no dependencies on any other module. And into that module, I'm going to create my app controller. And my app controller it's basically like a factory function or a constructor. And this is it here. So it's that bit of code there. But what's interesting is that when this constructor is called to instantiate the controller, we receive this parameter here, which is called $scope, and that $scope is being injected into my controller, and it is the scope that we talked about in the view. So anything which I want to interact with the view, I go through this scope, so I can affect the properties on this scope. So you can see here that I'm creating a list of currencies, attaching that to the scope. I'm then initializing the from and the to currency to point to different values in there. And then I'm attaching this helper function, calc currency, to the scope. And what it does is the business logic we had earlier. And you'll notice that there's no DOM mention of the DOM in here at all. I don't go find the element that has that input and get the data out of it and do something with this span here. I'm only interested in the data, the business rules. Okay, I'll let AngularJS worry about connecting that up to the template and moving it into the right place at the right time. Okay. Now, I said that testing comes out of the box. Let's just see that in action. Shouldn't really be any different, yeah. So you can see that the drop-downs have already been populated with the correct item because we initialized it. This all still now works. But what we can do is also write a load of tests. Using, actually, not Mocha. Why did I say Mocha? This is Jasmine is the one that comes out of the box with AngularJS. So what I've done is I've written a Jasmine specification for this app controller. It has two specs, basically. One is that it should set up the currencies correctly, which was creating that list. And then the other is that the value should get calculated correctly. And we can see that I have a spec file here. It should set up currencies. And I'm saying I expect that the length of the currencies array should be greater than 0, and that the from currency and the to currency should equal the first and the second values in that array. And then equally, I can mock up some values on the scope. I've set a from value of 40. I've created a mock from currency and to currency, and then I've called calc currency and checked that it actually equals the value I expect. And again, I'm not having to think about how this is represented in the DOM or how the browser deals with all of this. I can purely focus on my business rules. There's a little bit of setup that you have to do. You have to load the module that you were particularly testing, that you want to test, and then I need to get access to the scope. So here, I'm saying before each test, inject into this function the root scope, so the scope that's attached to my ngApp, and a service called controller. And this $controller service is what I use to instantiate my app controller here. So you can see it's very easy to quickly create a test-driven development process, because it's so easy to create tests and run them. Not that you're always going to be running them with an HTML file like this. But the way that Angular provides this dependency injection means that you can easily get to a point without having to really think too hard about how am I going to test this. You can just get straight in there. So this kind of gives you a general idea of what an AngularJS app looks like. If you were to think about any programming language, whenever you create a function, there's a scope, like the parameters that you receive, or if you create local variables, they kind of exist within in a scope, and they're not available outside of that function. And this is analogous to what happens in AngularJS. So outside of the ngApp, you don't have access to these variables. But also, you can create new scopes, just as you would create a new function in, say, any kind of imperative code. And those scopes have access to the things that are outside of them, but have some of their own stuff inside. And you can only access the stuff that's inside from inside. So this allows you to do things like repeat a block of templated view over and over again, and each view will have its own scope to allow you to interact only with that bit. So as a quick example, let's just go up here. So here's our original example. It's got pounds and euros. What I might say is that I'm going to have a div here, and I'm going to repeat for rate in 0.4, 0.8. So this is saying, repeat this div block, or iterate over this this array of 0.4, 0.8, and so in each case, this value of rate will be assigned to one of those values and will appear on the scope for that section. So in here, instead of saying 0.953, I can just put rate. And now I have two of these guys. And you'll notice that even though they both have a from variable that variable is specific to the scope of that repeat block. So these are independent. And you can see that the rate, hold on, is different. So one was 0.4 and one's 0.8. So this allows you to create quite powerful structures in your HTML and encapsulate whatever data is within that specifically to there, so you're not stuck with loads of global variables. Now the next section, so what, this is all very well and good, but in reality, in SPAs, what you need to do is connect to the internet, get yourself some data, pull it in, do stuff with it. So what we're going to do now is actually load up our exchange rates from a service. So you can see, look, I've got a massive list of exchange rates here. And these come from a web service called Open Exchange Rate. So we can see if we've got 1,000 rupees, it gets you almost 1,000 yen, which is interesting. I mentioned in one of the slides that we have various services, and one of them is called $HTTP. It's basically like a wraparound XHR, like XML HTTP requests. And this is basically where it is here. So you can see in my controller, instead of just asking for the scope to be injected, I've now asked for a couple of other services to be injected. And I don't have to worry about how these get created. Angular's going to create them for me and then provide them to me. And once I've been given this service, I can then just simply call methods on it. So I'm doing a get call. It returns a promise. Does anyone know what promise is in terms of asynchronous programming? So a promise is a promise to return some data. So rather than having callbacks saying, I'll call this method when the data arrives, it returns you an object which promises to give you the data when it arrives. And what you can then do is apply a then call. You put a then call onto the object and put your handler on there. And you can pass these objects around and chain then calls. It's very powerful. But you can see what I'm doing here is I'm making requests to get, first of all, a list of the currencies and their names. Secondly, the list of the latest values for the rates. And then and I'm attaching that to the scope. So in our view now, I can use a new directive called ngOptions on my select, which says, for some reason it does, oh yeah, it's okay, it's on the next line down. It says for currency values, which is the thing on the scope, which I've just added, I'm going to iterate through getting the label and the value, and that's going to generate all of my options for me. So again, my template is declarative. I'm not having to write imperative code to generate all of these options. I can say this is how I want it to look, and it's doing it for me. We can test this. And the nice thing about being able to have dependency injection is that I can mock up backend. So I don't actually need in my tests to use the actual calls to the server. I can make pretend ones. So I can say, look, whenever I request this particular URL, I'm going to return this static bit of data. And that means my tests are fast and they are reliable. They do exactly what I want them to do. And I can then just test things like that. Our currency names and values get set up correctly. And if I run the tests, you can see I've got 2 passing tests again. and it was really quick. And if I show you in the network here, run them again, there's no call to the web service here. Whereas if I go to the original, you can see here it's got the 2 calls at the bottom. Okay, so that's nice, but you can see that there's still a lot of kind of verbose HTML going on. And one of the things that you can do in AngularJS is create your own directives. All of the directives that you've seen so far are just written in using an API that we can all use as well. And so some friends and I set up a project called Angular UI. And the idea of this was to create a load of reusable bits of code, so widgets, components, filters, input boxes, and so on. And it's been going for about 9 months now, and we're getting quite a lot of features, and people are starting to reuse it, and it accelerates your development process. So as a quick example, so we've got things like a Google Maps widget. And for this to work, we have things like a UI map info window. Oh, that's not very easy to see, is it? So rather than having to write loads of boilerplate code, you can just label your div saying, this is where I want the info to go. And here we've got UI map, my map. So this is an Angular UI directive that says, this div is going to contain a map, and it's going to be connected to my map, which is an expression on the scope, which contains all of my points and so on, all the information. More simply, here's a date picker widget. This wraps the jQuery date picker widget, but you can see this is the all you need. I've just put UI date on my input element, and it does all of the work for me, so I don't have to connect these things up, and it automatically attaches whatever I've picked in the date picker into this date property on the scope. And so you can see that as we choose new dates, everything gets updated automatically. And for those of you who like Twitter Bootstrap, we've also created wrappers around most of the Bootstrap bits and pieces. So here's an accordion, which all works very nicely. And you can see here that I think this is a really good demonstration of what you can do with Angular. We've just created a whole new set of HTML elements. We've got accordion full of accordion groups. And in fact, we've not only just got, here's a static accordion group where we can set the heading and whatever's inside is the content, but here we're even repeating the accordion group. So we're going to create multiple accordion groups based on data that's in our scope, which allows us to have this like group header 1, group header 2, they're generated on the fly from the data. But you can see that this means that our HTML becomes much cleaner and easy to read. And this is just HTML. I mean, it wouldn't pass some HTML validation tools, but we can actually do things about that. You can put, if you're in Internet Explorer, you can namespace it and treat it like XML. You can, for things like attributes, this is saying, if one at a time is true, then make sure you close all of the other ones whenever you open one. You could put data hyphen in front of this attribute to make it HTML5 compatible. But most browsers are quite happy with this anyway. We can have alerts. Here we go. Look, we just put There's my alert. And I can add new ones in on the fly. So there's quite a few bits and pieces that are already out there for helping you build your applications very quickly. And they just kind of work, which is nice. I'm not going to have time to go into the next two sections, but all of this code that's here is up on GitHub, and I'll post a link to it somewhere. And you're welcome to go and have a play with it. And each of it should just run by itself. The last thing I wanted to do was show a slightly more involved example. So what we've got here is the same kind of thing going on again, but I've used one of those Bootstrap widgets, which is called Typeahead. So if I type in GBP, it automatically starts to choose things for me. Normally this would be quite a lot of effort to write, either in JavaScript, if you include someone else's library. If you wanted to write it yourself, it's quite hard. Euros. But in our code, because we're using our Bootstrap UI code library, all I had to do was create an input and just say use Typeahead directive, and I then specify that I want it to select me a currency, and it will look like this label, and it's selecting it from these currencies. And then when I selected it, it's going to attach it to an element on the scope for me. Okay, so you can, and also I created a little new directive of my own, which allows us to limit the number of decimal places. Okay, and you can see that actually the amount of code is quite small. It's basically just having this single function which says limit decimals, and then I just attach it to my ng model, saying whenever you're formatting a model onto the input box, make sure you call this function, and whenever you're parsing one from the input box back onto my scope, then again call this function. And just to make it look nice, I also call it whenever the element gets blurred. So if we look at our rate converter, if I start typing in lots of numbers and then jump off, it automatically drops back to 2 decimals. And even though the calculation would have created multiple decimal places, this is only going to 2 decimal places here. Okay. Angular's really, really growing fast. Probably the most important thing to compare on here is this yellow line. This yellow line is Backbone. It's traditionally the most well-used of these kind of JavaScript frameworks. And you can see that this is in terms of searches on Google for those terms, that Angular in the last 6 to 12 months is just going up through the roof. Whereas the other ones are kind of, staying about the same. So there's obviously something happening here. It's worth looking into. If you want to find out more, there's a rather nice book coming out by some people that know a lot about Angular, apparently. So you can pop along to PackT and pick up this book, which will tell you a lot more about how to build full front-to-back web apps, including things like security, optimizing your application, and how to deploy it and things like that. Okay, so that's enough for me. Feel free to come and find me outside if you want to have a question, because I've got 1 minute left. I'll just be in the little atrium there, and we can talk about what, if you've got any other thoughts about what I just showed. But thank you very much for your time.